said, we're a high-boring band. Come to your town, we're gonna burn it down. All right, welcome everybody. This very early Saturday morning, I'm glad you all can make it. This panel is Barbaric Wonder, Robert E. Howard and the Evolution of Sword and Sorcery. So we're going to probably run through everyone here, and I'll give a brief intros, and then everyone can tell their own spiel and talk about some of their work. Yep. Down at the end is Frank Coffman. He's an expert on Robert E. Howard's poetry. Edited the selected works of Howard's poetry, and the selected poetry of Robert E. Howard. He's a professor at Rockville College? Rock Valley College in Illinois.
Rockville.
Dierk Gunther is Gunther. I always have trouble with the umlauts. He does have an umlaut in his name. He's very metal. Dierk is an English professor at the Tokushima University in Japan, and he's also an expert on Howard. Dan Look is a sorcerer of arithmancy. He's a math chair of the math department, actually.
Yes, I am.
At St. Lawrence University.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Yes. Just making sure you're still there, right?
Yes.
Jonas Prida is also an English professor at College of St. Joseph.
Yes. And vice president of the College of St. Joseph.
Really? When did that happen?
It happened in January.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Well, thanks. I'm falling upwards.
Yes. Good job. He's also the editor of Conan the Cimmerian, which is a collection of essays on the character of Conan, both Howard's version and Coffman's version. My name is Jeffrey Shanks. I'm an archaeologist and a pulp historian, comic historian. I'm an expert on Howard as well. I just edited The Unique Legacy of Weird Tales, a collection that's part of that magazine with Justin Everett. Jonas had a chapter there.
Yes. We're up for an award.
We are up for this. We're nominated for Bram Stoker. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about what sword and sorcery is a little bit. And as we do that, maybe everyone can kind of give your idea. What is sword and sorcery? We often talk about Robert E. Howard as the father of sword and sorcery. But what does that mean? What is sword and sorcery? It's sort of a subgenre of fantasy. The term itself was actually coined well after Howard's life by Fritz Leiber in the early 60s. Sort of retroactively trying to come up with a term to describe this type of fantasy.
It's Leiber? I've been pronouncing that wrong my whole life, too.
Yeah,
it's Leiber. These things you read but don't hear people say, right?
Right.
When you're a lonely child. Where's the yours, for example?
Yes.
So they're giving instructions on it. It's EI, it's the I, it's I, it's the E.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So let's talk about sword and sorcery. What is sword and sorcery? Jonas.
Well, what isn't sword and sorcery?
Good point.
Well, Monsters and Treasure doesn't quite have the same ring. That's always been my feeling on it. So for me, sword and sorcery, I mean, in addition to what it says it is, right, there's going to be swords. And the element of magic, to me, is an important one. Because it helps separate it from sort of just like, in some ways, the 15th century Knight Tale, right, where it has a lot of the same stuff. There's guys in armor, they fight each other, they break into and get the gold. But the big difference will be that there'll be some skeletal army that will then attack them for breaking in. And so the sorcery element is the thing that, to me, is the definitive part of the Conan moment. So in that early Weird Tales period where a lot of that Conan grows out of, there are other people who do, as you know, that do stuff that's like sword and sorcery, but it's that caveman feel, right, where it's spear and fang, to use the other Howard one. So it doesn't quite have the magic element to it. And I also think it's interesting that the use of magic is limited in a lot of
At one point.
Where it isn't easy to use. To me, that's one of the keys to it, is that like it's really arcane art, and so most of it is people fighting each other, and then occasionally you have, something like that, where there's somebody who can tap into the universe, but most people can't.
Yeah, because that was going to be one of my big ones, is that the sorcery element is downplayed compared to other forms of fantasy, right? In the Sword and Sorcery, it's a lot more, in many cases, the protagonist that you're cheering for isn't going to be using the sorcery themselves. It's going to be either they're going to be working with somebody who does, or working primarily against people who use that sorcery. And the sorcery also tends to be, a lot of it's mixed in with stuff that we wouldn't really consider sorcery, right? So you find the Black Lotus or whatever, and you mix something up and you blow that in somebody's face.
It's more alchemy.
Yeah, it's almost more of an alchemy than a magic. And again, that's a place where I think the camp and Howard differ. The camp, I think, had when he's writing his, had more of a magical element, and the creatures who are supernatural on their own because they're giant winged apes, all of a sudden they're also giant winged apes who are summoned from hell. Not hell, but some other place, a demon, essentially. And so yeah, you need the magic or your sword and sandal in some ways, right? But the magic always felt like it was not the main goal.
What do you think, Gary?
Basically, I'll speak to the library definition actually. It's barbarian fighting against the evil magician, and generally it's the action version of fantasy. But okay, I might be a bit early to saying that while Howard was the one who's credited to having invented that genre, I would actually say that Howard, strictly speaking, is not sword and sorcery. We should actually try to get him out of that genre.
Oh, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
We're showing up this morning, everybody.
What do you think, Frank?
I would agree that the library's coinage, I think, is just completely on target. It's not straight adventure, but the sorcery mixed in is interesting. It's usually the evil magician or something like that. But it's a sorcery that can be defeated physically by prowess of Conan, or trickery, or outwitted somehow. The sorcerer will not always, will never prevail, usually in that case. But the idea of adventure, barbaric adventure, bumping into a bunch of magical options and possibilities, but able through sheer physical prowess or trickery or cunning to defeat that, and ultimately will, of course. But I think Library's right on target with the coinage, and that's why it's stuck.
Yeah. I think for me, all of you sort of touched on things that I think are parts of it for me. Jonas, you mentioned sort of the medieval adventure, the historical adventure of, Walter Scott or, this kind of thing, but adding the supernatural element to it. I think that's a lot of what Howard was doing. He was reading a lot of, things like, Arthur Conan Doyle's The White Company and these sorts of, medieval adventure things, but he's also reading, early weird fiction and these kind of things. And so he's kind of blending those two elements together. And, to me, that's why, Sword and Sorcery, as opposed to something like the high fantasy of Tolkien or, some of the later 80s fantasists, when that was, really a big thing, Terry Brooks and these guys. It is, that low magic kind of feel, but it's not just that there's less magic, it's that the magic, and you kind of alluded to this, I think, is not a part of the story world itself naturally. It's an intrusive element, usually, into the story. And so in that sense, it's more like horror fantasy, where the supernatural element doesn't belong. It's irrational, it's unnatural. And, even with sorcerers, as they're using that, they're in some way manipulating the natural world. And so it's inherently not a good thing. The heroic protagonist usually, this kind of gets at what you were saying, Frank, is sort of the, generally is the person who is opposed to whatever the supernatural element is. And so they sort of serve as the narrative means for restoring the rational world and getting rid of that irrational element, whatever it is. And so in that sense, it has a lot more, it's much closer to horror, I think, than traditional fantasies in a lot of ways, except for the trappings, except for the swords and the armor and these sorts of things, I think that's sort of the feel that you get from Sword and Sorcery that's a little bit different. The magic isn't an inherent part of the world, right? It's not the magical land of Hyboria. You know, it's really our world. It's a rational world. It's had supernatural elements come in it, and the heroic protagonist is usually set against those, set in opposition to them, in order to sort of restore, you know, the empirical world to normality.
That way it's a little bit like what Lovecraft is doing, where the evil forces are trying to come in from the outside.
Exactly,
And the
right.
cosmic, you know, the old ones and all that
That's
stuff.
right.
And there may have been, certainly probably was some cross influence there.
Oh, no doubt.
But
Yeah.
especially on
No, absolutely.
Lovecraft on Howard, because
Yeah.
he was so much younger.
Yeah,
And that
absolutely.
Conan can always smell it,
Yeah.
right? When it's like that idea that, oh yeah,
Right.
that this is unnatural in some ways, and that his clean barbarism, you know,
Right.
his hackles come up about it, and that it is
Right.
the eruption.
Yeah. So, you know, often, you know, and this is maybe we can get to what Dierk is saying. You know, Howard is often considered the father of sword and sorcery, but what does that mean? You know, I mean, certainly there were precursors, you know, and you know, often the Shadow Kingdom is usually put forward as, you know, the first sort of war sword and sorcery story. That's a King Kull story, not a Conan story, actually. And you know, but you could certainly make a case, depending on how you define it. And you know, and many people, you know, up here on this panel, we've come up with multiple ways of approaching, you know, what is this subgenre, you know, and you know, depending on how you define it, you know, it's tough to say which was the first, where did it start, and really it was more of a gradual process when you look at his stories. But you know, there are certain stories that that were precursors to this that some people can say. Frank, you could probably talk about. I mean, of course, you get the early fantasists.
Well, I think
You
we
know,
have
like
to
Norse
look at
MacDonald.
William Morris as the founder of mythopoeic fantasy.
Right.
And you know, there's in some of his stuff, the roots of the mountains, the well at the world's end.
Right.
There are magical elements and things like that. But you know, that man of many talents,
Right.
wallpaper design, furniture design,
Yeah.
50 books, so it's a shelf, you know, at least. Maybe not so much George MacDonald, but he's coming from a supernatural angle because of the religious connections
Right.
in his fantasy. So Lord Dunsany
Yeah.
has to be.
Yeah, Dunsany's often cited as somebody as an early pioneer. The Sword Unvanquished, you know, in particular, is usually
Well, the Sword of Welleran.
Yeah, Sword of Welleran.
That's probably his best.
yeah,
It's in there. He's got all these
Right.
micro stories. They're like a page and a half. But the Sword of Welleran is probably the epitome Dunsany
yeah.
short story. And it's got some supernatural elements in it. Basically, we find out who the real good guys are at the end. It's a surprise ending sort of thing.
Right.
But there's some, you know, ghostly things happening, and the spirit of so and so reappears and things like that.
Yeah, I think you know, Haggard, H. Rider Haggard, you know, of course, had
The Viking story.
the Viking story that had
Eric whatever.
Yes, Eric Bright Eyes. You know, is another sort of early kind of prototypical sword and sorcery story, I think, and Howard certainly would have read that for sure. He did read Haggard. You know, I think too, the early Sword and Planet stuff of Burroughs, although it's, you know, set on another world, it's set on Mars, you still have a lot of the same elements that you see. You know, you still have the sort of the swashbuckling historical adventure aspect of it, but mixed with you know, speculative elements. You know, in this case, it's, you know, more science fiction elements. You know, but that plays the role that sorcery does. You know, in later Sword and Sorcery, and of course, you know, Howard certainly read, you know, all those early John Carter stories as well. So
Creatures in there that would play a supernatural element. I mean, like if
Right.
you read Almeric, I mean, you still have, or it's not Almeric, I'm thinking of. Who had the winged? Was it?
yeah, that was Almeric.
Okay, with the winged creatures in and so it's like that's a creature that would fit very easily into a Conan story, and in a Conan story it would be considered supernatural,
Right.
Even though it's no more supernatural than it is in Almeric, right?
Right.
It's an evolutionary thing in
Right.
in Conan, but yet it's given this supernatural feel. So a lot of the supernatural stuff in Conan, I always felt, wasn't really supernatural. You know, like the magic spells are you. I mean, with the exception of things like you know, Tower of the Elephant and stuff, where there's some actual.
Well, but again,
But
Tower of the
so-
Elephant is an alien.
Yeah.
True, but he does turn a person into a spider.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Yeah,
You know.
but the Hyborian age spiders were just bigger by that time.
And they only had 2 legs, right? It's ridiculous. But it still felt like, you know, other than that, it's a lot of powders and.
Frank, you have something you want to
There's kind of a sliding scale, as I see it,
Right.
in some ways, because Burroughs, I think Burroughs' Tarzan has some influence too, because
Oh, sure.
almost everything seems magical to him
Right.
at first, because he's
Right.
that other world that's the world of civilization as we know it
Right.
is alien to him.
That's a
And,
good one.
he's bumping into that clash of.
Right. I think in Howard's fiction itself, you can start seeing this evolution too. I mean, all these ideas were out there percolating, and he was feeding on a number of them. Jonas, you mentioned the prehistoric fiction, right? And this was something that you saw. That's kind of a. Today we don't think about prehistoric fiction as being much of a genre other than Clan of the Cave Bear maybe.
Turok.
Yeah, right.
Because he had a resurgence in the
Turok.
90s.
It was.
Yeah.
That's right. But that was there were a lot of prehistoric
Yeah.
fiction tales out there, and Howard, that's where he started. His first published story was Spear and Fang, which was, a story of Cro-Magnons fighting against Neanderthals, right? It kind of started with that, and Frank, there was some poetry as well that he wrote.
Yeah, well, the precursor
early
stuff
poems.
to Conan would be, so they're fragmentary things, Amra,
Yeah.
the Ta'an,
Right.
T-A-A-N, just snippets. It's like there may be 200 lines total. Never a completed story, but it was starting off, and then Howard himself sort of claimed that well, of course, there's all the letters with Lovecraft back and forth on civilization versus barbarism, but the poetry, especially the one poem that's really in this world is Cimmeria, but it's almost the seminal poem. It's also one of Howard's only one or two excursions into blank verse, and by T.S. Eliot's standards, it's darn good blank verse. It's just a well-written poem, and according to Howard, it was his observation of the hill country around Fredericksburg, Texas, and sort of a foggy morning, and the inspiration of a place,
Right.
Geography, and then of course all of his mapping and stuff. As you were saying the other day, or yesterday, that Tolkien's coming from his invention of languages, and that grows into a world
Right.
that he has to map out. Howard's coming from much more of a historical, geographic kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so the historical fiction, too, then is another element. So he's doing prehistoric tales early on, but then he also starts doing historical adventure and historical horror. More traditional Gothic horror stories, but set in a historical period. The early werewolf stories that he does, for example, they take place in the historical period. And there was some of this going on. I know Jonas spent a long time reading. He read like the first decade of Weird Tales. You actually got a grant to go do this.
Yeah.
At the,
Yep.
And so, why don't you talk about some of that early Weird Tales stuff like that were sort of precursors?
Oh, that was weird. That was my alarm letting me know it's time to wake up.
Yeah. You've been late. H. Warner Munn, for example, had some werewolf stuff as well. So some of these stories are sort of more traditional horror, but set in historic periods.
Yeah, and so you see. One of the things that's interesting about Weird Tales is that when a story works, we've talked about this before,
Yeah.
you just immediately then 10 other people write a story that's like that,
Right.
and then Munn's werewolf stuff is one of those, right? It runs 2 or 3 issues, and it's almost always at the top of the reader's poll about what they like, and so people start writing more of those kind of things, and so you get to see this progression of the different kinds of monsters people are starting to explore, along with the ones where they go, we make our sphere that takes us to the moon. There's lots of these, right, that have that interplanetary thing, and then you get dropped down on the moon, and then it's like a prehistoric world. There's a lot of combat in them, and some of it is straight out sword material. Sometimes they'll have what we think of as lasers, but it still has that same feeling of we're not really sure what we're going to do with this stuff yet because we don't have the rules for the genre.
Right.
And that, we know that we don't necessarily need to have this fake contraption to get us to the moon. We can just set it on the moon next time. And so it develops over the course of that first decade of knowing what you can finally get rid of because the audience now knows how the rules of the game are going to work, which to me is an interesting development in both the writing of the stuff and in reader sophistication about how this developing genre of weird fiction is going to go.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think Weird Tales is unique in that way, and it was just a strange place where all of these sort of fledgling genres kind of came together and blended and mixed, and there's this hybridity of genre going on. that started to coalesce into their own things after a while. But it took a while to get. It took this interaction. It took fans interacting with the pros via the letters and things like that. And this works and that doesn't work. And it's maybe even something that's kind of unique to commercial fiction, like Pulp Fiction. Where you're not writing, the author isn't just writing for himself or for his own needs, but he's writing, specifically for an audience and what's going to work, and so you get a lot of this trial and error, kind of thing going
what
on.
they care about, right?
Yeah,
Because again,
right.
like you mentioned, they'll just forego explaining. I mean, some of them go into great detail on how some of these contraptions work and how like the magnets can get you to the moon and things like that.
Right.
But then later on, you find, well, with different authors, that's just again not an important piece.
Right.
We're there. We built this thing. We do a smart science. Almost like when you're reading Almeric, right? There's no time spent on explaining how the scientist's device works. He just says, "I have a device that can transport you to another planet.
Right.
You seem like a guy who could use that right now. Let's go."
And I think that's one of the differences, I think, between Sword and Planet and this type of stuff in hard sci-fi, where you don't waste the time explaining that. Let's jump right into the action and start moving the narrative forward rather than spend a lot of time.
Yeah,
As you said, the genres are amorphous, really. I mean,
Right.
you can take sci-fi back to Byrne and novels of science and that sort of thing, but some of his are pure adventure, like Around the World in 80 Days, things like that. The Weird Tales, they call themselves the Unique Magazine.
Right.
And in that, there are also some amazing, across, people who are going to, young at that time, but Ray Bradbury, Tennessee Williams,
Right.
there are all sorts of folks kind of getting their foot in the door.
In that mix.
Weird Tales.
And so that milieu of all this experimenting and different genres mixing and all that, that's sort of what Howard came up in. And so by the mid-20s, he starts experimenting, and then he began the first Kull story. And it started as one of these prehistoric stories. The very first Kull, it's actually a fragment. And it's got the character Ra in it from his earlier caveman stories. He appears in this first Kull fragment. So you can see where he's sort of morphing into this and starting to add some more fantastic elements to it. But it's just a fragment, and it was published later as Exile of Atlantis. And I think Len Carter completed it, in the '60s paperback. But he abandoned it, and for a while, and came back to it later, and came back with Shadow Kingdom, which most people consider to be the first, true sword and sorcery tale.
A progenitor we forgot to mention, Jack London.
Yeah, there you go.
As an obvious one,
Yes.
and they're now. I should have thought of that earlier.
Yeah.
Because of my American naturalist training, but
Yeah.
he's and Howard talks about how that's one of his favorite writers.
Yes, and in particular, he talks about the Star Rover
Yes.
as his favorite novel. And for those that aren't familiar with the Star Rover, a lot of people don't realize that Jack London wrote a lot of speculative fiction. Some of it, the Red One is pure sci-fi, science fiction.
Iron Heel.
Iron Heel is a dystopia.
Ernest Everhard.
Futuristic dystopia.
Seriously, that's the guy's name. Yeah.
But Before Adam is a prehistoric adventure, like we were talking about. But the Star Rover is a story of reincarnation, where this guy is imprisoned in solitary confinement in San Quentin, and so he can't move physically. His body is immobile. He's trapped in solitary confinement. Can't see anything. But he's able to project out and visit his past lives. And so London uses this as a framework story to tell a bunch of little small stories set in different time periods as this person in prison is reliving their past lives. And one of those is set in the Roman Empire, but it's the character of a northern barbarian, Ragnar, who starts up north, and he travels down into the Mediterranean civilization area and has adventures, right? So this is an early prototype for that sort of Conan archetype, the northern barbarian that enters into civilization, bringing his barbarism with him and all that comes with it, and becomes this sort of monkey wrench in the cogs of civilization, and that's Conan, without really the supernatural element, so very much a prototype there. So these are some of the things that are percolating. Solomon Kane comes up during this time as well in the 20s. Kull actually predates Solomon Kane. He started writing the first Kull story, but Solomon Kane was published first. And so the readers of Weird Tales would have seen Solomon Kane first. Solomon Kane is this Puritan adventurer, right, in the Elizabethan period, but he ends up fighting, traveling to Africa, and there's several Burroughs type, the Moon of Skulls in particular was a very Burroughs-like, almost pastiche, where he finds a lost city in Africa. This is straight out of Burroughs basically, but he starts encountering Lovecraftian type monsters and things like that, and this is where the influence of Lovecraft, I think, and the cosmic horror starts to come into play, and I think that's where it's you're really starting to get some of those elements. Morgan Holmes just recently did a chapter in the Weird Tales book on this, and he mentioned he talks about some of the things we talked about, Sword and Planet, Munn's werewolf stories, and all that. But he also makes a point that really it's once you start getting Lovecraft's cosmic horror added to it, then you're getting what we really think of today, I think, as sword and sorcery.
And part of that's coming probably from the fact that the world is. Lovecraft always struck me as right, the fact that he has the cosmic horror, which is that we are insignificant and don't really matter.
Right.
Because it's coming out of this 1800s view of us unleashing something by accident, by going too far with our science.
Right.
And then it's spun around into no, don't you worry about that. The world's too big already. If you have anything to worry about, it's that these things will notice you, not that you're going to actually unleash anything.
Right.
And so this whole idea of the world being bigger than you know seems to come into play with a lot of this discovering of lost and ancient forgotten towns. That's what it's called.
Hamlets.
Yeah, the lost Hamlet. Tarzan and the lost Hamlet.
Yes.
One thing is we haven't talked about is the influence of historical stories. For example, when did he write his Crusader stories?
A little bit later.
But because one of the theories is actually that he wanted to write in the historic field, and he was afraid of these anachronisms. And there are several letters where actually people complained about Howard having made mistakes. For example, in one story he let the Muslim drink wine, and there was this indignant letter, how dare he, and he had to reply actually, then, dude, listen, I have this example, so the Muslim is drinking alcohol, so it's okay. And he felt somehow a little bit intimidated by the fact that if he made mistakes, he might have been out of business, because in the end, he was a pulp writer, and he needed to write a lot, and he needed to write fast. And historical novel, the plot is not sufficient. You need to actually do the research and create a really realistic background, and that was for him as a pulp writer, why he loved history and he knew a lot. It was just too much, and so he went for the obvious and just mixed or created his own history, and that might actually say that's
Frank, you want to add?
The other genre that I think has some impact is, and I know Howard, Haggard and Conan Doyle even with The Lost World, that genre of the Lost World story.
Right.
Haggard, she, and that sort of thing. Of course, they're putting it in modern times and just a place we haven't bumped into yet.
Right.
But Howard, in a sense, good idea. Let's go back and create this prehistory of, of that current time and put my main character in that ancient world.
Well, getting back to that absolutely. I think getting back to what Dierk was saying too. So, with Solomon Kane, he's writing this historical adventure, but he's got supernatural elements in it. He's at this point he's mostly just published in Weird Tales. That's about the time that he wanted to start branching out and getting into. He actually submitted the first Solomon Kane story to Argosy, and they rejected it, so he was able to publish it in Weird Tales. But then he wanted to start doing just more straight historical Crusades adventures and things like Harold Lamb was doing an adventure. And Weird Tales came out with a sister publication, Oriental Stories, right at this time. And so he had an opportunity to do this. So he starts writing these Crusade stories. And as you say, it was hard for him. It was a lot of research. When it's real historical adventure, you've got to have all your facts straight, or the readers will call you on it, like you said. And so I think that's where after selling a few of those, he just felt comfortable coming back. What if I could write these, but add in some of this cosmic horror and some of these other elements? Some of the things I played on with the Kull stories, the fantasy elements, and bring them all together, but set it, give it the tone of a, one of these Crusades medieval adventures, and from that's where we get Conan. It's sort of born out of that.
Yeah, but coming back to the Solomon Kane, because it's like a historical story. But for example, exactly who is Solomon Kane himself? You might actually argue that Solomon Kane is not a historic person for a historical novel, but that might be this biblical Kane. It might be some kind of semi-supernatural guy. For example, this obsession with following somebody for months and years, and Solomon Kane is steadily wandering, and in the weirdest places.
I mean, I think you clearly get the impression too that Kane is not entirely, although he's the protagonist of the story, he's not all there.
Yes.
He's driven. It's all about vengeance, and and he's intentionally, he's a little bit off.
Is it the Wings of Araka, or what is that?
Wings of the Night.
Yeah, where he like burns all those guys.
Yeah.
Oh, and he has the severed head that cocks to him for a while. It's
Yeah.
like, wow, that is some bleak material
Yeah,
there.
Did they steal that for that Tom Hanks movie when he's talking?
Castaway.
Yeah.
There's your next paper.
There you go.
Okay,
So,
I'm still going to write about that.
It's in Welsh
So-
mythology too with Bran.
So one of the cool things I
okay.
think, about Solomon Kane too, and this goes back to the cosmic horror idea, right? That Dan was talking about, where we're looking at this Lovecraftian cosmology, where it's just very much a mechanistic universe, and there's if there is supernatural out there, it's not really supernatural. We're just misunderstanding
we don't
something that we
understand,
don't. It's too big for us to comprehend. And in the Solomon Kane stories, you get this interesting progression with the character as. He's this very religious Puritan to start with. And his cosmology is very much almost an Old Testament Judeo-Christian cosmology. And as he starts encountering all of these, more Lovecraftian things and things that are, ancient Atlantean stuff, and all of these, his worldview is being challenged in each one of these stories. And you see him starting to, wow, this is actually older than, this could be pre-Adamite and whatever. And no, it's just the will of God, and it's, and he'll come back and he'll force himself to come back to this Judeo-Christian mindset. But that keeps being challenged more and more as you go through the stories. And I think that's one of the interesting things about it. And so you see this, in a way, that's kind of the way this genre is evolving too. You mentioned sort of the early, just straight up historical adventures with the Judeo-Christian cosmology, the medieval, kind of things, morphing into, now something that's got cosmic horror elements into it as well. I think you kind of see that progression with the Solomon Kane stories.
Nalunga, right?
Right.
Because they become buddies, and that whole staff thing, and he still
Yeah.
doesn't really know what to do with it.
Yeah,
It's fun to watch Solomon Kane, not Wagner's Kane,
Yeah.
have to play the mental gymnastics on if it's okay for them to be friends. Is it okay for that guy to use his magic on that stuff? And it's interesting character development.
Right.
You don't usually think you would get out of a character like that.
Right. All right. So let's talk about Conan.
Scarlet Citadel.
Okay. So Conan. All right. So 1932. All these things have been percolating out there, and he's really trying to get through with a series that's going to sell. And he's trying to find the right thing, and everything sort of comes together just right. Almost a perfect storm with the Conan stories. And the first one, Phoenix on the Sword, was actually a unsold Kull story that was rewritten, to be a Conan story. And he sends that in. It gets it gets published, and so he immediately cranks out a couple more right off the bat and sends them in. Some of them are rejected. One of them is. Another one is accepted, and this is sort of the beginning of that Conan series. So let's talk about Conan. Who is Conan? Why is it that Conan took off in a way that some of these other earlier precursors didn't? What was it about Conan?
I think part of it is there's this friction of, not to state the obvious, but the barbarism and civilization.
Right.
Forget the barbarism part of it, but I think that there's an undercurrent in culture of a fear of where we're going as the industrial age continues, and we get less and less, I hate to use the phrase, but less and less manly, right? Because I think that's one of the things that Howard was a little bit afraid of.
I think there's a masculinity anxiety going on.
It's when physical education is starting to be forced on school students and things, and it's all kind of, I think, related. And Conan embodies that, and it's not just that he beats everything up, right? Because he doesn't. So there's also a bit of an intelligence that's not a book learning kind of intelligence that's going on.
Right. That's interesting.
Well, and of course, Howard, I see Conan in some ways as Howard's superego, in the sense of a projection of physically he was trying to be and was quite strong. He's going out hacking around with a sword-like machete or machete-like sword.
Boxing, right?
Practicing what he's preaching.
Yep.
And there's this. He also even writes how much of it we can believe, but the character sort of springs forth from. It's like from Athena from the mind of Zeus or something. It's like it's a thing that's just an organic thing, but he projects his own physical fitness, his boxing, all of his, he wants to be the healthy mind, the healthy body, or at least the healthy body. And then whatever mind he ends up, he's so at odds sometimes with himself.
What about the social historical context of when Conan, 1932 is right at the heart of the Depression.
Yeah, that
Let's talk about that.
I have done a little bit of work in this. To me, that's what it is, right? I mean, not that's the only thing, but that helps drive a lot of this. Is again the guy who's going to sort of handle the problems of civilization, where everybody is corrupt in some ways, and so a lot of the people who are reading our pulps, it's kind of aimed at them, right? It's like lower middle class and working readers, and so when you feel like it is all rigged against you, it's nice to have the force from the outside just to solve your problems. And Conan talks about this, right? In Cimmerian, nobody goes hungry.
Right.
And several times there's almost this populist sentiment that comes out of there. And so it's why it would be harder. I mean, we can always play this game, but it would have been hard to write Conan in the 20s when things are going well.
Right. Yeah.
Because all of a sudden then when it's flush times, you don't need the person who's going to like wipe out the corrupt king because everybody's getting rich.
Right.
And it all is about there's so much corrupt king and lawyers and things like that that are.
Yeah. One of the great the scene in Queen of the Black Coast. This is where he's taken before a magistrate, right?
Yes.
Because in this one
That's
town,
what I was just referring to.
right?
My favorite.
Because one of his friends, was arrested for something, because he got in a fight with the city guard, and so Conan's got to go there, and he ends up, he tells the story later, with a complete straight face, and they were going to put me in jail because I wouldn't, rat out my friend, basically. So, clearly I had to pull out my sword and cleave the judge's skull because they were all insane.
Clearly, that's my favorite word. Clearly, and it's not really his friend.
Seeing they were all insane, this magistrate, these civilized people, I had to just kill them all and run away.
Stole his horse and rode the ship.
I really hate to say this, but I think that Howard really just hit the perfect visual thinking of, and he made it out there, because that's also the reason why Conan is still popular nowadays. Yeah. Because, Conan, let's be honest about that. Everybody would love to be like that super bodybuilder, be free and beat up people. Come on.
Sure. Wear your sandals.
Okay, this is being videotaped right now. Come on, university board meetings. My mind games. You have no idea what's going on. That's Conan. No, but seriously, I really think that this is that he somehow that this is just perfect visual thinking, and he put it in this great form in this new environment. This Hyborian age, where adding the wonder. Yeah. Wow, that is I know it might sound really cheesy, not very academic, but I think that's probably the big secret.
Yeah.
And was he really? I mean, the person he wouldn't rat out in Queen of the Black Coast, was that really a friend, or
not even a friend, of so much as a comrade of his arms,
just somebody he didn't feel he had a reason
to rat him out.
Yeah, this is the right place to do this.
It was just a drinking buddy or something.
Yeah,
that
somebody
they had just met.
I have no reason to send this person to jail, which is what I feel like I'll be doing if I tell them where he is.
Yeah, okay, another friendship, honor, and all that stuff. This is somebody standing up for you, and even if you hardly know that person, wow, wouldn't you like to have a buddy like that?
Yeah.
I'm going to cleave the match.
Right, and so
exactly.
Well, and so this idea kind of permeates the stories, right? That civilization is problematic, and that there's something more natural about barbarism, right? So we get the famous line in Beyond the Black River, that one that when you quote the Conan stories is the one that gets quoted the most. Civilization is just a whim of circumstance, and that barbarism is the natural state of mankind.
But as I've noted a couple times, it's not spoken by Conan.
That's right. That's right.
So,
it's not spoken
so
by
I see him as a much more. I argue that because he's the protagonist, he's got to be better than the lesser barbarian.
Yeah.
But that's only one point. He's far more civilized in some ways. He ends up as he's a king.
Yeah, story. That's right.
So
here's one of the things I love. What is he doing in the very first story, Phoenix on the Sword? It's later in his career. It starts, the stories aren't in order. He's a king already. What's he doing at the very beginning?
He's writing.
He's drawing a map, and he's filling in countries that the civilized people don't know about, right? This is how Conan is introduced to the reader, right? Not the big muscular, Arnold, dumb brute, basically, but this person sitting here writing. He doesn't have a sword in his hand; he has a quill, in the very first scene when he's first introduced. And I think that's something that that's lost about this character. It's a far more complex character than people realize in the pop culture version of the character that
And
most
that's-
people know from the comics and the Arnold
It's
films and these sorts of things.
In the
You
draft, that gets even much better because
Right.
he's totally depressed actually about sitting there, and he's really like totally sad. He would like to get out of that whole thing,
Right.
and that was unfortunately cut.
The the whole barbarism versus civilization thing. It needs to be. A lot of people don't understand what that means. There was this was going on at the time that came out of this long several year argument that he was having. Excuse me, that he was having with H.P. Lovecraft. This in their letters. And arguing over what's better, and Lovecraft, of course, is arguing that civilization is the ultimate state of human. This is and Howard's arguing this is it's not normal. You become weak, you become corrupt with civilization. There's problems with it. When you talk about these terms, civilization, barbarism, savagery, they had very specific meaning, anthropological meanings at the time that these guys were writing. And I spoke about this a little bit yesterday. To people like Lovecraft and Howard and early 19th century anthropologists, savagery, we use that, that's become a pejorative term, but that had a very real meaning back then. It was just a term that meant a culture that was at a hunter-gatherer state level. Barbarism meant that was when you got to the next stage, in cultural development, and you developed agricultural and metallurgy. Civilization is when you get writing and those sorts of things. So these terms had very specific meanings when Howard and Lovecraft are arguing with each other. To us, we tend to we equate barbarism and savagery as kind of the same thing, but they were very different things, right? So when Howard says barbarism is the natural state of mankind, what he was saying was that it was the equilibrium, that sort of the middle ground between the two extremes of savagery and civilization. And that between, instead he was sort of challenging this idea, the sort of false idea that anthropology had in the 19th century of straight unilineal cultural evolution. You evolve, all civilizations go from savage to barbarian to civilized, and that's just how it goes. What Howard is saying that no, that's not really what happens. You can move up and down this ladder. Civilizations can rise, they fall, they're overthrown. New ones come in. It's a much more dynamic thing. But the natural state is right there somewhere in the middle of barbarism.
But as you said, the Brits, in the Victorian age, there's a prevailing cosmic optimism. It's sometimes called the notion that progress is happening. We're getting better. Of course, they're using this partly to. That's why we can build an empire, because we know what's going on, and we're moving the world into a better situation. And so that writers like one that Howard admired, Chesterton, kind of sees it the other way, that the civilized have to keep defending the gates.
Right.
But if anything, there's a pendulum swing.
And that would be Lovecraft's argument as
Civilizations
well.
would rise up, and barbarism will take the upper hand.
Right.
Fall of Rome, that sort of thing.
Right.
And it takes a few hundred years, but
Right.
things swing back the other way.
Right.
So that this pendulum thing is much more what some others.
Yeah.
And Howard, I don't think, lived long enough, perhaps, to maybe have that mellowing of for a man who's only 30
Right.
at the time of his death.
Yeah, we forget how young he was when he died. He was only 30, and so he's still working out a lot of these ideas.
Yeah.
But I think Conan represents that, as that barbarian, then he is that liminal figure, right, between these two extremes. And even in the story where this is talked about, narratively he functions that way, right? This is in this story, it's essentially a frontier story. It's very much with colonialist themes. You have this highly advanced, the most advanced kingdom of the Hyborian Age, Apollonia, medieval level of technology, that are expanding into this wilderness and pushing out the savage Picts, right? Expanding and colonizing their space. And the story takes place on the frontier, and there, there's all this conflict between the two, and ultimately, it doesn't work. And I think he's, in a lot of ways, he's really critiquing colonialism here in this story. How it just doesn't work. You can't do this. But Conan, he's right here on this border, right on this frontier space, between these two extremes, and he's able, because he's a barbarian, because he's at this sort of natural state, he's able to operate in both spheres successfully and navigate both spheres, within the story too itself. That's why I think it's really one of his best works. Howard put a lot into that story and got some of this philosophy in there, whether it's, accurate philosophy or not. He really put a lot of his own ideas into that. And it's an interesting thing. It's a lot more complex than people think and than people give him credit for. Other thoughts?
I was going to tell him about the Conan the Adventure cartoon.
Oh, and well, this will lead into this actually, because you're going to talk about Conan learning to read, right? Oh yeah. God, that's so good. I was just going to say, to lead into that, it's a neat commentary that Conan is filling out this map of places that people don't know, where he's out scholaring the scholars in some ways, but it's not because of scholarship, it's because he actually went out and did it.
Yeah.
And it's like you can get so far with your book learning, but if you don't actually go out and do things, you're going to be limited, so that he can come in and fill in these maps and things like that of scholarly work, really, because he's been out there and done it and seen it.
Yeah.
And because he can now read.
Thank you, Dan. So in the 80s and early 90s, they did Conan the Adventurer cartoon, right? That was aimed at kids, but it had, Roy Thomas writes some of them, so it's interesting enough. And Dan and I one time watched the streak of them. And there's a moment where Conan can't read, so he gets kicked out of the tavern. Right? He doesn't realize that it's closed.
Yeah, he doesn't get kicked out. He's banging on the door.
That's right. He's like, "What do these symbols mean?" And so
let me in. It's only 8 a.m.
So one of his partners, he has like a traveling companion. This is me again. Jeez,
you really need to get up, dude.
I know. Teaches him to read, and so it's that moment of like you see him kind of like furrowed brow over the scroll, and it's just interesting that they're trying to put that progression and like retrofit it in because they know it's an important thing for Conan.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
And it makes him look more like it makes him look less intelligent than I think Conan was.
That's right.
Right, because it puts him on this level of like, of course he needs to learn how to read, right?
You hear there's several little snippets in the stories where you hear, he mentions that he hung out in the courtyard listening to the philosophers at one point, trying to, but I mean, what is this?
I found this scene of Conan learning to read.
All right.
But you keep going. Pass this sloth video first.
I figured what I was saying. Why don't we, while you're looking for that, why don't we see if we have any questions? Anyone got anything? Yes.
I have a question specifically about Beyond the Black River.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, it seems to distill the philosophy down, but it's also like the exception to so many of the kind of general rules of both kind of the sword and sorcery that Conan develops.
Right.
And so many other things. So it's one that's not from Conan's perspective; it's from the civilized perspective.
Yep.
And it's true that what makes Howard's work different from Lovecraft's is that it's almost always some kind of not brawn, but like human skill and determination that beats the sorcery rather than having to blast your sanity by completing a spell. But in Beyond the Black River, Conan draws the
That's right.
room.
Yeah, you bet.
It's the one where he's willing, he's the one who understands the old magic and is willing to use it.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that moment as an exception to that rule of sword and sorcery?
Because I was gonna
go ahead, because I got my thoughts.
Yeah, I was thinking about that earlier. We never see Conan with a magic sword, right? He never does something like that where he gets the Vorpal Blade +3 or whatever it's going to be, right? It never falls into that thing, and it is always this. I'll throw the sword at the magician because he's not looking for it, but never that I really embody the magic either. In Arrow of the Dragon, when he takes the heart around, that's the other time that it's in some ways close. But as you say, doesn't do anything with it. He just has it.
Well, it's the reason I think partially that in Dungeons and Dragons you get that barbarians can't use. They're very restricted on what magical weapons and armor they can use. And they feel part of that's that Conan was suspicious of it, and
they feel that. But to your point, in the original stories, it's really not so much that way. I think some of that, idea.
Sure how much was DeCamp?
I think a lot of that is DeCamp. And you see him. Some of those, in fact, some of the lines that we get that from are DeCamp insertions. The things like the barbarian's natural fear of magic. Right. That is absolutely a DeCamp thing that was put in there. You do get that Conan is kind of suspicious, but he gets it. He's used to it. There's the, he's dealt with it so much that he's not afraid of it anymore. He becomes more of a practical about it.
It also seems that the magic in that story is a little different because it's kind of the leftover Atlantean
It is.
nature empathy,
Yeah.
rather than the kind of ethereal
People from the Black
power.
Circle kind of feel, yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's more naturalistic.
It also has a setting that's,
Right.
it's almost like, I'm gonna squeeze some sorcery into this.
Yeah.
Right.
I gotta do it somewhere, but.
Yeah, because it's essentially a frontier tale set in, more like a, it's more like a, the Deer Slayer or Last of the Mohicans, Fenimore Cooper type story set in the Hyborian Age. But yes, there's the other scene, in Zuthal of the Dusk that's great where there's what looks like a dead person who gets up, and he kills him or whatever, and his companion that's with him, oh my God, what if he gets up again? Well, then I'll kill him again, and if he gets up again, I'll just keep killing him until he stays dead, So there is this sort of he's kind of dealt with it enough, and in sort of his younger stories, he is more afraid, in God and the Bull, he encounters this weird, snake human Naga type creature, and he kills it. He does kill it, but then he takes off running like, oh my God, that was crazy. But he does do, that's the difference with Lovecraft. He does kill it first before he runs off. He doesn't just, cower up in a fetal position, quivering in terror, as his mind is blasted. And so, there's a more practical sense to it. Again, and that is the difference where, yes, humanity may be small and weak and insignificant in this vast cosmos of horrors and things that we just can't understand, and that will squish us if they notice us. But we're not going to give up. We're still going to fight. We're still going to go down fighting these things with a bloody, frothy curse on our lips as we go down, slashing. That's sort of the sense, of Howard, and that's the difference between Howard's.
There's that great scene in Scarlet Citadel when he's like trapped in the dungeon, and it's all just like Lovecraftian horrors as he walks through there, and he just is like his ability to kind of like see them out of the corner of his eye and realize that's not the passage to go down. And just kind of keeps walking there, right?
Go this way.
Yeah.
That is different, and that is again DeCamp's later take on the character where DeCamp was coming from a hard science fiction tradition as well, and so he had this tendency to want to put everything in order and get everything quantified and make it all nice and neat. These are the rules of what a barbarian does, and that sort of thing, and he tried to shoehorn everything into it, and his ideas about and that's a different take on the character, and that it's almost not fair to say it's better or worse. That's a matter of personal taste, but it wasn't what Howard was trying to do. He had a much more, I think, complex view of the characters, and I think that's one of the reasons why Sword and Sorcery itself has gotten such a bad rap. There's the attempt, even a lot of people prefer to use heroic fantasy, as a euphemism for Sword and Sorcery, because it does, because that term is, it has these sort of negative connotations, and a lot of that's because of the stuff that came out in the 70s and 80s. Not just the Conan pastiches, but the knockoffs. John Jakes' Brack the Barbarian and Throngar by Lynn Carter, and all of these sort of subpar, and then all the movies. After the success of the Arnold movie, then there was a whole slew.
Deathstalker.
Deathstalker.
Love that movie.
1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
Right? And Barbarians and
Atoll the Fighting Eagle.
Right, and so you had all these really low budget things, and so it came to become the redheaded stepchild of fantasy, sort of the sword and sorcery subgenre.
The first Arnold movie did poignantly show that he was taught to read.
Yeah, that's true.
So before we get to Dan showing us the clip of Conan read, you were going to say something about how you didn't think Howard should be involved in the sword and sorcery.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Because that was like a natural
right. Let's go back
segue
to
for
that.
that.
Absolutely.
No, because it's while Howard actually introduced tropes, if you look at Howard's stories as a full, complete works of that, it's way more complicated than the simple sword and sorcery pattern where barbarian arrives in this isolated place, meets a damsel in distress, a bad magician kills him off. There's way much more going on. And in the end, all these pastiches and all that later stuff, like you said, Brak the Barbarian, all that stuff gives sword and sorcery a bad name, and that is once again being directed at Howard, it's not his responsibility that this genre turned into such a crap.
Yeah.
And I really think that, for example, as Howard, it all comes also from the historical
Right.
corner, that we somehow need to come up with another way to define his work. We should accept that he created the templates, that he started the genre, but we need to somehow think to give Howard credit in a different way that much more honors actually what he actually achieved.
Right.
But the classic detective story with Poe and Doyle, look at how many schlocky imitators of that there have been.
Right.
So like Chesterton says about the detective story, there is such a thing as a good detective story. The fact that there are tons of bad ones doesn't mean that it can't be an accepted literary form.
Right.
So, but yeah, you're right. Reflexively, it's come back maybe to haunt what most people initially think of Howard. All the sword and sorcery, formula fiction. Life's a formula.
Yeah.
So I argue for formulas all over the place.
Yes.
Doyle does pretty well with the 221B, knock on the door, telegram arrives. But it's all sorts of different stories.
Right.
But the template is there, I think.
Yeah. See, I'm okay with the term sword and sorcery. I want to reclaim it and
Really?
pull it out of the gutter. You know,
No,
you know?
no, it's because it's also sword sorcery gives we were just talking about how
Right.
complex and how smart Conan is.
Right.
And sword and sorcery actually stands for me for the dumb barbarian.
Yeah.
And that's once again not what Howard is.
Yeah.
Don't help me out here.
No.
Support.
Sort of going along with what we talked about earlier, how in Weird Tales, when something works, there's immediately a bunch of other things like it. That happens with Conan, and so it's interesting that the turning the tropes into something else happens almost immediately, because and within 2 years of it, we're already seeing another type of sandaled barbarian figure who stumbles into the castle and overhears the palace intrigue and breaks up the king's party and blah blah. And so it kind of has that where it happens so fast that it does become it's incredibly murky about what it gets to be called.
Right.
And I think you are right with it. When you're using a term from that you coined in the 60s to look backwards at something else, that's always problematic.
Right.
And
It's anachronistic.
Yeah.
I think one of the things too, what I like about what George Martin has done with Game of Thrones is he's going back to some of the sensibilities of sword and sorcery with that in a very effective way, much more effective than the actual sword and sorcery knockoffs, of the 70s and 80s. If you think about Game of Thrones, this idea of a low magic, yes, he did not get pacing from Howard. Let's get that. Let's put that out there right now, right?
That would have been 20 pages.
But the idea,
Apologize.
right? But the idea of of a low magic world, right, and where the supernatural elements aren't really a part of it. It's a very realistic. It's a secondary world. It's a very realistic, gritty, rational world. The supernatural elements are intrusive into the story space, right? They're beyond the wall, right? Or they're the dragons that are in the past. They're not part of this rational world. And when they do come in, they are intrusive elements. That they either have to be kept out, they got to be pushed out. It's getting a little bit more high fantasy as the dragons start to play more of a role, but. Those first few books in particular, and the ones that have been the most popular, and the ones that have appealed the most to more mainstream non-fantasy readers, were these really more low magic, books, and the supernatural elements have more of a feel of horror to them. The White Walkers are more like ice zombies. It's much more of a historical horror kind of feel, like what Howard was doing, and it's not a coincidence. Of course, George Martin's, is a big Howard fan. He's actually more of a fan of Solomon Kane than Conan. He's on record saying that, but it's not a coincidence. Now, the epic length of it is much more in tune with what we think of a high fantasy. This massive
Robert Jordan.
size,
Yeah.
Robert Jordan. Some of that may be commercial more than anything else. But the sensibilities and the way he deals with the supernatural and the interaction with the supernatural, very much more of a Howardian sword and sorcery kind of feel to it, and being done in a very effective way, and in a way that is able to bring fantasy to a wider, more mainstream audience that's not so much into genre fiction, in a way that's, even I think the Lord of the Rings movie I don't think it was even as popular as Game of Thrones has been now. Maybe it was close. It was big.
Yeah.
But Game of Thrones has really, made this kind of thing, much more acceptable to a mainstream audience, that's not into fantasy normally. I don't know.
So on Red Nails, I'm trying to think about like how some of the stuff is working. Where at the end of Red Nails, where they almost have the laser beam.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's those magnets that are involved there.
That's
To me, that's another one of those interesting moments where it's like super sci-fi. It's more Thundar the Barbarian than Conan the Barbarian.
It's like Atlantean super science type stuff.
Yeah.
And you get this in several places.
Rogues in the House.
Right. Yeah. Rogues in the House is
You
all.
see through all the mirrors.
Right. It looks like sorcery, but it's really sort of Archimedes level science.
Yes.
Right. That's exactly what's going on. That's very much. There's this sort of weird, antediluvian Atlantean super science kind of thing. That appears to be sorcery.
Yeah.
And you see them in these ancient lost cities that were from, so there is this idea that there's this lost technology in the past kind of thing. In that case, and this, modern readers, I actually was having an argument about this on at RPG.net. For those who don't know, I'm working on the new Conan role-playing game, right? And so it's interesting because I'm really having to go into this and deconstruct these stories and try to quantify them in a way, for this role-playing game, right? And one of the arguments was, oh yeah, there's magic in there. What about that magic wand he was using in Red Nails? And I'm like, well, actually, it's you can tell it's electricity. It's a wand that shoots electricity to this metal door.
Because he's constantly trying to move out of the way, so he isn't ever.
He's got to get the right angle in order, and so it's really not sorcery. It's this sort of super science kind of thing, that weird science, that's appears to be sorcery to the people in the story because they don't understand it. But it even appears that way to the casual reader who's used to these high magic tropes. They're used to Dungeons and Dragons and the wand of fireballs and magic missiles, right?
Yeah.
And so even the reader, even though Howard spelled it out on the page, the readers are still interpreting it from this high fantasy lens because that's what they're used to. Even though. If you read it, that's clearly not what's going on.
Well, electricity
that to me is interesting.
Pretty much is magic at the time. I mean, when he's writing this, it's 32, so it's kind of we're a little bit past that. But the idea of electricity still being an unknown, and when you go through weird tales and see things, N-rays is a good example, right? There's this thing that people hypothesize called N-rays. It was considered a real thing, after X-rays were discovered, right? These N-rays. It was real for like a month and a half, but yet. Until it's disproved, but then 10 years later, it appears in a weird tale story as kind of a central thing. So there's a lot of this science is unknown, and so we just aren't in the same place to read that in the same way that they would be reading it, unless you think of us with quantum physics, right? Would be the closest thing I can think of as a comparison to. We don't really get it, and so it may as well be magic as far as we're concerned.
Right. More questions? Yes.
I'm kind of new to the whole sword and sorcery thing, so
welcome.
Don't jump down my throat.
Yeah.
Right, I don't think this is the start.
We're pretty late.
I'm getting the basic just feel of it from what you guys are saying, but it seems like there's a lot of this kind of the Ubisoft theme of how there's the sorcerer, which is kind of progress, and the barbarian, which is kind of the way things were.
Right.
And you kind of agree that that's what the main theme seems to be, is he's lamenting almost on how good things used to be and how progress is actually going to kind of damn society.
Yes. Oh, I absolutely think that's part of it. It may not have been a conscious element of it, but I think that's very much part of it. Well, we've talked about this with this too, with Weird Tales being, that you do get this sort of anxiety about science and progress and technology. I mean, this is, you had this, just came out of this industrial revolution, right, where everything's, this is, technology is now going to change everything. We're going to, there's worries about people losing jobs, as factories, come into play and all this sort of thing. And technology, it's getting better and all this. And then what did technology lead to? World War I. Right?
And 15-hour days in the sweatshop line.
It's one of the appeals of fantasy in general, because Tolkien, frequently said things like wishing for a world with less noise and more green and stuff like that. And obviously the world of Middle Earth is most fantasies set in that mock medieval, with sword and sorcery, not ray gun.
Right, and so there is this sort of looking back, right? I mean, this generation had just come out of World War I, this war where we went into it riding horses and charging into it with with swords, and you come out of it with tanks and airplanes and submarines, right? And this big fear now is mechanized warfare, and the big new threat is going to be aerial bombardment. That was a big fear at this time, and so there is this fear of technology and this fear that maybe. Technological progress may be good on the one hand, but there were clearly anxieties about it, and then you get into the depression, and how's it helped us now? Right? Where are we now? How is this technology helping us? We're starving. We're in bread lines.
Who's benefiting is the thing there.
Who's benefiting?
Right? Because sure, this makes life easier, but for the magistrates,
right? It's not making it easier for labor. It's making it easier. For the managers, for the owners, that level, right?
Part of that hatred of the upper class.
And that's civilization, right? That's the corruption of civilization, that kind of fighting it. And you're right that sorcery is it's very rare that you see sort of natural sorcery. You get it a little bit in Beyond the Black River, but for the most part, you're right. It's priests that have become bad and corrupt, and it's these what should be established. Figures in civilization that have become corrupt and dark and are doing these sort of things. Sorcery for the most part is a product of civilization.
I think it's important though to keep in mind that one of the things that makes Howard so interesting is that Conan is always he exists and thrives right at the interface between civilization and barbarism.
That's right.
Is Cimmerian isn't like the Shire. It's not some beautiful place that needs to be preserved and that produced the goodness of the characters and the laws of the effective. Every time Conan goes back to Cimmerian, he's like, oh god, I remember where I left.
Yeah, it's so boring. It's so boring and cold.
It's not necessarily the longing to go back so much.
That's right. That's a good point.
A kind of weird pop Nietzschean, only the best will thrive in the chaos of
right.
Any kind of settling is dangerous.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is dynamic, and he recognized that, and it was and you've got to make your way through that, and survive in that. We kind of touched on the masculinity aspect of it. And Josh, maybe you want to comment on this because I know this is one of your things, but I think that's part of it as well. There was this anxiety at the time of what is the role of the man in society now. This was probably a male anxiety for the most part, right? And this goes into that. This goes into that Industrial Revolution, right? Howard was working and writing in rural Texas, where you were expected to either work on the oil fields, be an oil hand, a roughneck, or be a farmer. These are the normative masculine roles, right, for that time and that place. And he was a writer, and so he was looked down upon. That's not something men do, and so he's dealing with this tension in a very real way in his life. But I think that you see that in this, and not just in Howard's fiction, but this sort of reclaiming of trying to figure out what is the masculine role in this new society that we're developing. As we become more civilized. I don't know. Josh?
I would do two sources for that. I find really useful, and then a question to throw back to you guys. Yeah. David Leverenz has an article called "The Last Real Man in America," and he traces figures that incarnate this masculine anxiety that civilization, while kind of a good in itself in many ways, produces soft feminized subjects. And there's a guy, his last name is Casson. I forget his first name, maybe Michael Casson. But there's a book about Eugene Sandow and Harry Houdini as characters during kind of the Depression era, who's became new models of the masculine male body during this time of anxiety. But speaking specifically of the context of Texas that Howard was writing in, how do you think the fact that of American territories, Texas was the one where national borders moved back and forth across it so many times and so recently in Howard's life? So it was really a recently settled national
That's what I
territory.
wanted to add because
how does that feed into his theme of different, the same territory having different civilizations roll back and forth?
Oh, that's a great idea.
No, Howard was actually he was a big fan of the old frontier, and that was actually I think that's what he was thematizing in the Conan stories too. That for him the old text, that was freedom, that was manliness, that was where this whole barbarian ethics were actually still valid. And Howard was lamenting that it was lost. I wrote this article about Old Garfield, where basically it was thematized, this loss of the old frontier. And that's actually what he puts in his story, like this learning after for a better time, and Texas was the place, because Texas was the last frontier.
Right.
Well, we need to channel Mark Finn.
Yeah.
See, he's the guy that read, of course, he did the latest, and far better than Cam's, biography of Howard. Rusty Burke, if he ever gets around to writing it,
Yeah.
would probably be the guy to fill in every blank, but
Yeah.
he's put that off so many times.
Yeah, you know, that Texas, I mean, there's so much Texas in Howard's writing, no matter what genre
Yeah.
he's working in. And, you know, Mark Fenn did a great job, I think, in his, he wrote a popular biography that's really good, and that was sort of the main thesis of that biography was, you know, Howard as a Texas writer. And that was something, you know, DeCamp never got, you know, when he wrote his biography of Howard, and it was, you know, you can imagine DeCamp, you know, this Yankee coming down to Cross Plains, Texas in the 1960s and early 70s, you know, and, you know, with his goatee and his three-piece suit, you know, knocking on the door in this tiny little town in rural Texas. And some of us, you know, have been to Cross Plains, you can really, you know,
preconceived notion of
you know,
Oedipal syndrome.
right.
And writes the whole book.
Yeah,
based on that
and you know, he
psychiatry.
just couldn't understand that about Howard. You know, he just you know didn't get how much of you know that idea of the dying frontier was there. There is this conflict between you know civilization there, because he would see his father was a traveling doctor, and his family until they settled in Cross Plains would travel from oil boom town to oil boom town, and so he would see all of a sudden civilization erupting in the middle of nowhere with these oil boom towns and the things that came with it, the corruption and the fighting and drinking and prostitution and all of this, right? So this is all of a sudden springing up here in what was a natural environment, and then moving on to and then falling and collapsing. Right, as it once the wells are dry, boom, it falls and collapses, and you move on to the other one, and then everything that was built there becomes a ghost town, and it's gone. And so he was absolutely seeing that on this sort of microcosmic scale, of little civil boom towns popping up and then dying and falling, constantly.
Morn, Blood and Thunder. Maybe are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Is the title of his biographical work, but he's probably got some essays here and there that he's given talks I know about Texas as a character and how that sort of thing.
Yeah, highly recommend that. Picking up Art Finn's book.
The book that I mentioned was John F. Cassin's Houdini, Tarzan, and the Perfect Man.
Oh, wow.
And so he talks specifically about Burroughs and
right.
how Burroughs worked in, but I think a lot of things he says about Burroughs' fiction apply
Absolutely.
to Howard as well. If Howard's father was a doctor, do you think that seeing the way that Boomtown people react to kind of the rapidly changing medical technology.
Oh yeah, maybe.
I think that plays into the kind of alchemical magic.
That could be. That's an interesting idea. I hadn't really thought of it. That's a great point. That's a great idea. I do think that a lot of what he was treated to, there were a lot of really bad injuries on these oil fields. So people were arms ripped off, and those are the kind of things that he was treating at home. And so I know, Howard, you would have seen a lot of gore. And I think that's certainly, a lot of his descriptions, he was always, that was, I think it was Edmund Wilson, Superman on a psychotic bender is how he described the Conan stories in the 1940s when he reviewed it, and he's like, he was just appalled at this gore and stuff, but, this is stuff Howard would see. He knew what it looked like, to see somebody have an arm cut off or whatever, and,
But Wilson didn't like anything.
Wilson didn't like anything, Yeah, he didn't. He trashed Lovecraft too. That certainly played into it. But he makes a statement to Lovecraft one time, talking again about writing about Texas history. And in his westerns, he's like, I can't even write about how violent and bloody Texas history really is, or they would think I'm a sensationalist. I have to actually tone down, and I can't even be as realistic and as violent and as graphic as the real West was, because they'll think I'm just a cheap dime novelist being sensationalist or whatever. So there's so much of that in his work, I think.
And I was going to say that the subtitle of that book actually is pretty telling as well, that you were mentioning, Josh, is that correct? Yeah, because it's Houdini, Tarzan, and the Perfect Man, but then the white male body and the challenge of modernity in America.
Oh, that's
right.
perfect.
So I mean, that's just
that's on the list now.
It's
And,
great. It's great.
you know, and you know, let me put this out there. Howard was heavily influenced by Burroughs. He doesn't talk about Burroughs a lot in his letters, maybe because he didn't want to advertise that he was reading an author that was already considered more of a children's author by that point. But he owned more Burroughs books in his library than any other author, even Jack London. So he read all of those, and you see Burroughs elements throughout most of his stories. He was also familiar with Houdini, of course, because Houdini was appearing in Weird Tales, being ghost written by Lovecraft.
already.
But he was also into physical culture early on as well, and so he absolutely would have known who Eugene Sandow was and Bernard McFadden and all of these early figures in that physical culture movement, itself, which itself was this, we're so worried that men are going to become soft. Yeah. Right, because we're not doing this naturally anymore. We're not doing physical things, right. And so we got to go out and we've got to artificially, regain our sort of masculine strength, So Howard went into that. He got into physical culture and was working out, lifting weights, and doing these things, So, he was absolutely very much a product of that thinking, and those things.
And interestingly, DeCamp. Now that I know,
was not.
Now that I know, well, not only that, but he I don't want vilify is probably too strong of a word, but he talks about how his the hypermasculinity of Howard is a symptom of a disorder.
Right.
Right, and this plays into that his view of but still everything was a symptom of a disorder as far as his sleepwalking meant clearly he was
and really it's more not so much a symptom of a disorder, it's a symptom of the times and the culture at the time and the ideas, the sort of shifting ideas of what it means to be a man in Western society, that was going on at the time.
DeCamp viewed it as a disorder.
Yeah, DeCamp thought it was a disorder, yes.
Yeah. But DeCamp, I think, is responding to one of the same things you pointed out, is that the Conan stories came out and immediately this rush of recognition happened, but they were, I think, in many ways, the imitators are responding to the masculine anxiety and populist anxieties, and only reproduce those aspects of the story.
Right.
So kind of the wits against wizardry aspect is lost, and it's just kind of, muscles against...
It's just the trappings that survive.
Muscles against
exactly. Right.
That's your next pulp game.
There you go. Yeah. Now we're talking. Kickstarter starts this summer. We'll be on that. All right, how are we doing on time? We got time. Does anyone have any more questions? You guys could.
Yeah. We get to see that clip for Conan.
Oh yeah, let's do that.
If you want to see that.
What a way to finish it off. Yeah, perfect.
I got the clip and some images. So this is from Conan the Adventurer, which is pretty interesting if you haven't seen it, partially because, as I recently learned, one of the main themes of it seems to be very DeCampian from his Tritonian Ring series.
Yes.
Where DeCampian, I should say.
Yeah, and DeCamp was around when this was done in the early 90s still,
saying,
and still kind of in control of Conan properties. So
this is 84, I think, right?
No, it was late 80s, early 90s. I think it was like 91.
Adventurer?
Adventurer, 91, 92, something like that. Yeah.
So this is the scene where and I might have sound, I'm not sure. I mean, it's not going to...
So much about books, but I know when my stomach needs to be fed. Open up! Open up, I say! I'm a hungry man!
We're closed!
Closed?
Can't you read, you stupid barbarian? Closed!
You dare call me a stupid barbarian?
Why such anger? After all the sight.
After all the... Yes.
Say closed.
My anger was not because it was closed. I cannot read.
So then we get into this awesome montage of him learning to read, which is like this. And my favorite part is the ending of his Adventure to Read, where he signs his name and he adds a flourish. He can barely make a C, right?
But he knows enough.
Yeah.
Classy it up.
So good.
It's copperplate Conan.
Yeah, he also drew this, I think. This is his map.
And this is why Sword and Sorcery has a bad name.
How did we watch it, Dan? Pirating?
Oh yeah. I pirated those, and then we got into it, and it was
Yeah, 92.
And
92 to
here's a sad
93,
thing.
yeah.
There's actually so many elements in this story that are
it's
that really do come from the stories. That
Jebel's Hag.
the truth is, this
in
is
some ways.
this cartoon, for all of its campiness and flaws,
Better
and
than Arnold.
it's probably a more accurate, even with all of its.
He
This is
drinks
still the
on a
most
cartoon.
accurate representation of Conan. That's
pretty
horrifying.
sad.
Yeah. But it really is.
And it's a story with a. One thing I liked about it is it's a story with a. Well, it's a story.
Right.
It had a full arc.
Right,
Yes,
yeah,
it's not
It has an
He-Man
arc,
where,
right.
or I mean, I remember Flint Dill, who actually worked on this as well as the Transformers and G.I. Joe series,
Yep.
was just like, oh yeah, we never spoke to each other when we were writing these things. I had no idea what other episodes were out there. I'm just writing an
Right.
episode.
Yeah.
But here,
Right.
there's an arc, and it actually ends. They actually
Yeah.
concluded after the, what is it, 65?
Yeah.
65 episodes. Watch
Yeah.
65 episodes. We wasted a lot of time.
Yeah. Sadly, this is there's more Howardian elements in this than any of the other adaptations of Conan, the Momoa film or the the Arnold films. Although Momoa, I thought, was a very good representation of the character.
Yeah.
Oh, I loved his grin.
To lump the two Arnold films together.
Yeah.
Very different.
They're very different. The first one, it has many problematic elements. The most problematic of which is just Arnold's body.
Right.
It's
He's
not
not
actually poorly written. I think it's in some ways a repetition of the problem with Howard stories themselves in Weird Tales, is that they came out and then Arnold's body fulfilled a need in 1980s American culture, and people just couldn't see a lot of the actual film for their identification with that kind of hard body masculinity.
And Destroyer, although written by Roy
just-
Thomas,
yes.
may as well have been written by Gary Gygax,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's a Dungeons
right.
and Dragons story
Yeah,
with
right.
a party. You have a thief who's
Yeah.
a comic thief. Then you
Right.
have the super tall warrior dude.
Bombada.
Yes.
World champion, yeah.
Bombata. So, and that's an interesting thing too. I mean, Gygax was a big fan of early sword and sorcery, and a lot of the early version of Dungeons and Dragons was coming heavily from Howard and Leiber.
But also from Ben Vogt.
Yeah, right, absolutely, and Jack Vance as well. It was the Tolkien stuff. Kind of, they threw in references to hobbits. They became halflings later after they got sued.
Treants and Ents,
right? But for the most part, it had a very much sword and sorcery, vibe, the early version of the game. And so it's funny how but then Dungeons and Dragons itself became more high fantasy over time. That fed back into representations of sword and sorcery, and so you get things, like Conan the Destroyer. Dungeons and Dragons itself and its influence on fantasy is something that needs to be, I know people have done work on it, but it's you cannot underestimate just how much influence Dungeons and Dragons and tracing how Dungeons and Dragons itself developed and became popular over time, influenced literary fantasy through that same period. I mean, it just hugely influential, and both feeding back and forth, between each other.
And then at certain points you start to have novelizations of Dungeons and Dragons stuff and all of that going on.
Yeah, and then you have like Erickson, where you have Dungeons and Dragons campaigns that he then turns into stories, into novels and things like that, and so things work both ways. But,
and if you go back to, I mean, even the evolution of, because the prototype for Dungeons and Dragons, chainmail,
right?
I feel was more. It's almost like D&D has the high fantasy element because there's much more magic.
Yeah.
And chainmail.
That's an interesting point. Think about the way Dungeons and Dragons was created. It's almost the same way sword and sorcery was created by Howard itself. It started with medieval adventure, and they decided, hey, let's add a magic supplement, a fantasy supplement to that, and that's what created Dungeons and Dragons. It's almost the same identical process that went on, with Howard.
And interestingly enough, you can now buy chainmail. Right? They've re-released chainmail. So.
Oh, they have.
Oh yeah.
So I don't have to pay $4,500 to get a copy.
Nope. It was part of the deal with when the 2 summers ago. I remember I went to the local store at the time and asked about what's 5th edition going to be like, because that was what it was about. And they're like, well, they decided they couldn't really make everybody happy after the travesty that was 4th edition, and so they're just going to release everything and let people decide. And so in the store there was a copy of He-Man. Is that what you said about 4th edition?
No.
Oh, I heard He-Man. That would be actually kind of accurate, since 4th edition had everybody being superheroes. But you could then buy a bound copy of chainmail. Those rules. You can make sure I'm not lying to you.
I don't think you are.
I don't think so. All right. Well, we're out of time. Almost out of time. Any last thoughts? Anyone? on the panel?
We should write that Dungeons and Dragons book.
I like it. I like
Let me
it.
know if you're doing that.
Yeah, cool. Sounds good. All right. Well, on that note, then
Thank you.
we'll close it off. Thanks, everyone.
Yes.
Yep.